Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the January 2026 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of the KPD in the face of the rise of Hitlerism, which is the first chapter of a book titled The German Communist Resistance 1933 to 1945 by T. Derbent, originally published 2008, English translation 2021. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, in recent weeks, we have been fleshing out the Lenin against Trotsky playlist, and we will return to that as there's a lot of important texts and lessons to be learned there, but I wanted to take a break for a couple of weeks and do some texts on resistance to fascism in World War II and the period preceding World War II. Communists were very active in the anti-fascist resistance, and in fact, some communist parties were even able to take power after the collapse of fascist rule. In recent years, there's been a resurgence in far-right and even openly neo-fascist politics across the capitalist world, and I'm not just talking about the United States and Europe. Probably this is leading up to some kind of inter-imperialist conflict. It is, at any rate, indicative of a crisis of capitalism. And it's incumbent on anyone who is opposed to fascism to learn everything you can about what it is and how to be effective against it. Spoiler alert, liberalism is at best a very unreliable ally against fascism because liberal anti-fascism is incomplete and wavering. And of course, liberalism stands for the same capitalism that fascism is basically just the beast mode of capitalism trying to defend itself. So liberal anti-fascism is riddled with contradictions. They want to preserve the capitalism, and on that question, they are 100% more aligned with fascism than they are with socialism. But the liberals want to preserve capitalism in a way that differs from the methods of fascism. So really, the debate between liberals and fascists is really more on strategy and tactics for preserving capitalism. So look at, in the recent years, the behavior of the liberal political parties in the face of this rise of neo-fascism, and would you describe it as sufficient? I definitely wouldn't. In the United States, we have the Democratic Party, which colludes openly and directly with the Republican Party, which is the leading edge of the more nakedly terroristic, more extremely reactionary faction of capital. So, for example, you want to abolish ICE? Yes, let's tear down the entire post-9/11 police state. But actually to do that is going to require something like a revolution because both of the political parties, which more or less claim to own the US government system, will stand directly in the way of anyone trying to do that. Anyway, getting to the reading here, this reading is available from foreignlanguages.press, which is a Marxist-Leninist-Maoist publishing house, and they have lots of really interesting books which are available for free download. Also some audiobooks, and also you can purchase a lot of these in printed form for pretty cheap. And like I said, my plan right now is not to read this entire book, but I wanted to do at least this chapter. Maybe we'll do some more chapters, maybe we won't. But I at least wanted to point people to this book because I think this is the kind of thing that it would be really helpful to be looking at. As those who've been listening to the channel for some time will know, the entire point of this channel is to get a higher baseline of education for the existing left parties in every country, with particular focus on the United States because that's where I am, and to be honest, we need a lot of it here. For the purpose of what? Winning the class struggle. It's not to win internet debates or anything like that. This isn't an armchair history club. We are trying to spread knowledge and learn from the theory and history of the international communist movement, which has been buried, suppressed by the capitalist ruling order, so that we can incorporate this knowledge, these lessons, into our struggle and actually win. And also along the way, it can get you out of the doomerism that liberalism is absolutely rife with, because they can't envision a world beyond capitalism. Their slogan now, as capitalism decays, already having passed its historical peak, into fascism. If anyone has wondered why it seems like the chorus of liberals, like, again, the Democratic Party in the United States, for example, seems to be a better world is not possible, it's because a better world isn't possible under capitalism. And they can't look beyond capitalism. They want to keep selling you capitalism, which keeps getting worse. Why? It was born several centuries ago. It had its course of development. It peaked. And then after it hits the point of imperialism, which is an internationally integrated stage of advanced monopoly capitalism, that's as far as it can go in terms of historical development and contribution to human historical progress. In fact, we have another really excellent audiobook on the channel titled Fascism and Social Revolution from 1935 by a communist named Rajani Palm Dutt, which details how fascism actually starts to oppose even technological progress because it challenges the society to engage in social progress to accommodate that technology. But at this point, the capitalists have benefited from the growth of capitalism, but if it goes any further, then they risk social revolution. So fascism ultimately is capitalism trying to protect itself against the disintegration of the ruling capitalist order and its replacement by a proletarian-led, working class-led, socialist social order, which can actually resume progress, but without the narrow class interests of the capitalists dominating everything, which they've done since the capitalists took over from the old ruling feudal class. When socialism takes over, it's a turning point in human history because the ruling class, for the first time, becomes the numerically dominant majority of the population, and therefore the beginning of the end of class society. So like I said, over the next couple weeks, we will do a number of texts relating to various angles and aspects of communist resistance to fascism. Let's now begin Chapter 1 of the German Communist Resistance, the KPD, or German Communist Party, in the face of the rise of Hitlerism. In the 1930s, the KPD and its mass organizations had organized up to 1 million people and collected up to 6 million votes. And a side note here for context in proportion to the overall population, in 1933, the estimated population of Germany was about 65 million. Or in today's terms, like the population of California and Florida put together. Continuing, by the 1920s, it had developed an impressive political military apparatus for proletarian revolution under the leadership of the Militär Apparat, which performed the functions of staff, security, and intelligence service. This secret organization was in close contact with the state security services of the Soviet Union, the GPU, then the NKVD, and with the clandestine apparatus of the Communist International, more precisely, the West Bureau led by Georgy Dimitrov. The basis of the communist political military apparatus was a mass paramilitary organization, the League of Red Front Fighters, Roten Frontkämpferbund. This organization and its youth organization, the Roter Jungsturm, which had more than 100,000 members, provided military training for the militants, ensured the protection of demonstrations and picket lines, forcibly prevented bailiffs from expropriating working-class families, and disputed the streets with Nazi militiamen. Banned in 1929, the League of Red Front Fighters acted under the cover of the Kampfbund gegen den Faschismus, known as the Antifa League, which organized 250,000 militants. Between 1928 and 1933, the SA increased the number of Sturmlokalen in working-class neighborhoods, which served as meeting places, propaganda centers, and bistros. So commenting, this is basically a Nazi organization setting up Nazi centers in working-class neighborhoods. Continuing, the KPD decided on an offensive to eliminate these sites, and launched the shock groups of the Antifa League against them. From December 1930 to December 1931, this offensive resulted in 79 Nazi and 103 communist deaths. Of the communist deaths, 51 were killed by the Nazis and almost all the others by the police of the Social Democratic government, who, in the name of maintaining law and order, gotta preserve the ability of that quote-unquote gradual transition to socialism, continuing, flew to the rescue of the Nazi sites. The offensive against the Sturmlokalen SA was halted to prevent the KPD from being banned, like the League of Red Front Fighters. Footnote there, this concern to preserve the legal electoral terrain was in line with the Comintern's legalistic line of the 1930s and was not subject to reevaluation. At the 13th plenum of the Comintern in November-December 1933, Manwilski again replied to foreign communists who criticized the KPD for its lack of resistance thus: if the KPD had undertaken armed struggle against Hitler, I guess at this point, it would have fallen into provocation, unquote. Back to the main text, one reads endlessly that the KPD, through its excessive struggle against the Social Democrats, paved the way for Hitler. Comment, I got into no fewer than 3 such arguments in the last month on Blue Sky. Continuing, the communist leadership believed that the anti-fascist struggle involved the elimination of social democratic influence in the proletariat, because this influence distanced the class from a genuine anti-fascist and anti-capitalist struggle. This analysis had 2 premises. The first, erroneous, was the widespread idea at the time that the Nazi movement would not withstand the test of power, that it would crack both because of the workers' opposition and because of its internal contradictions. Footnote, these contradictions would indeed erupt. The SA, which spoke of a, quote, second revolution, meaning a second anti-capitalist revolution, was purged in the summer of 1933, and since these purges were not enough, Hitler ordered the Night of the Long Knives. The SS massacred hundreds of SA, starting with their leaders, Röhm, Gregor Strasser, Ernst, etc. Back to the main text and commenting, this idea was also known as the so-called trap of state power. Continuing, but the second premise of the KPD's analysis was correct. The will to fight Hitlerism was totally lacking in social democracy. The SPD's legalism, this was the Socialist Kautskyite Party, led it to fight the communists rather than the Nazis. It was a socialist police prefect, Zergiebel, who on May 1st, 1929 opened fire on the communist procession in Berlin, killing 33 demonstrators. Comment, in Minnesota right now, compare the statement of the Minneapolis mayor to ICE, get the fuck out of our city, with his actual actions of sending the police, who are in fact allied with and have made open statements in support of ICE, against the anti-ICE demonstrators. Continuing, it was the Prussian Socialist Interior Minister, Severing, who then had the League of Red Front Fighters banned. The following year, the Socialists allowed the adoption of the very repressive so-called Law for the Protection of the Republic. The communist mayors were no longer confirmed in office, and the police closed the KPD headquarters. The Social Democratic SPD voted for Article 48, which would give full powers to Hitler, and was the main architect of the re-election in 1932 of Marshal Hindenburg, who would choose Hitler as chancellor a few months later. Comment, to be clear, Hitler was not elected to that post. He had just lost an election, and the guy who won, who he had run against, appointed him. Continuing, the same policy was followed in the large ADGB trade union, where the Social Democratic leadership proceeded with massive exclusions of communists. On July 17, 1932, in Altona, a working-class district of Hamburg, the machine gunners of the police force, led by the Social Democrat Egerstedt, came to the rescue of a Nazi parade threatened by communist counter-demonstrators. 17 counter-demonstrators were killed. These facts gave particular weight to Stalin's 1924 analysis that, quote, social democracy is objectively the moderate wing of fascism. These organizations do not negate, but supplement each other, unquote, and a footnote. In a September 1924 article entitled On the International Situation, Stalin challenged social democracy as the, quote, moderate wing of fascism, and launched the famous formula, quote, social democracy is the twin brother of fascism, unquote. This analysis is generally presented as one of the pearls of Stalinism, yet it predates Lenin's death by a small margin. Comment, not really sure why the author put that in there, unless you're of the mind that quote-unquote Stalinism somehow is not in line with Lenin. Anyway, continuing, as early as January 9, 1924, according to a motion of the Presidium of the Executive of the Comintern, quote, the leaders of the social democracy are only a fraction of fascism that is hidden under the mask of socialism. That's quoting the lessons of the events in Germany. This was developed by Zinoviev in the part of his report to the Fifth Congress, entitled Social Democracy, a Wing of Fascism. Back to the main text. In summary, the KPD leadership rejected the idea of fighting exclusively against the Nazis and considered the idea of a quote-unquote top-down alliance between the KPD and the SPD to be a right-wing deviation. The KPD line thus envisaged a two-front struggle, constantly revolving around a central principle, that of the, quote, united front at the base, unquote. This principle consisted of allying itself with the Social Democratic workers in the factories and neighborhoods, while fighting against the Social Democratic leadership and organizations. It was a difficult exercise. The KPD could do or not do anything. It served, quote, objectively either the Social Democrats or the Nazis. The latter represented the blackest of reactions, but the SPD was infinitely more powerful. And above all, it was in power. It was the manager of German capitalism. Issues such as whether to participate in a Nazi-inspired referendum against the SPD government of the Prussian state, which were easy to decide after the event, were such complex and high-stakes problems at the time that they gave rise to terrible conflicts at the head of the party. Footnote citing Pierre Bruet's History of the Communist International, 1919 to 1943. Ernst Thälmann and Heinz Neumann apparently came to blows in the middle of the Political Bureau meeting. The exclusion of the Neumann Group in late 1932 did not put an end to the dances of hesitation. Back to the main text. In January 1933, the Nazis came to power. The communists reacted in several large cities with strikes and savagely repressed demonstrations. In February, the police invaded the headquarters of the KPD, the Karl Liebknecht House, and outlawed the party. On the night of February 27 to 28 alone, after the burning of the Reichstag, or Parliament building, 10,000 communists were arrested, including the main members of the Central Committee and 2/3 of the middle cadres. A few weeks later, there were 20,000. 60 camps, 30 special quarters in state prisons, and 60 detention centers were opened to accommodate them. In each neighborhood, in each locality, the little Nazi chiefs set up their private prisons and torture centers in cellars or empty factories. The chaos and abuses were such: 500 to 600 people shot or tortured to death, families upended, civil servants refused to participate in the parish priest's work, themselves sequestered, beaten and humiliated, etc., that they become the stakes in the struggle for influence among the Nazis. In April, the SA were ordered to hand over their prisoners to the SS, which was developing a network of concentration camps throughout Germany on the Dachau model. Terror was applied methodically and rationally. In June, the SS introduced the practice, which was to become systematic, of hanging rebel prisoners on the roll call square in front of the camp population standing at attention. The first victim was the communist worker, Emil Bargatsky. In spite of the waves of arrests, Ernst Thälmann, KPD's general secretary, was arrested on March 3rd in Berlin in a clandestine party apartment. The communists continued to openly confront the SA, which had the status of auxiliary police. Comment: in the last decade, when we've been talking about things like the Proud Boys or these other right-wing militia-type, vigilante-type, or gang-type groups, their purpose has absolutely been to supplement the police, because they stand for the same things that the police do. These have been the irregular forces there to supplement the regular police, because they could do extra-legal things that even the police couldn't get away with, while the capitalist state prepared to enhance the role of the actual police, as we're seeing now with ICE basically being deployed as a quasi-military occupation of U.S. cities. Continuing. The Gazette de Lausanne of March 2nd wrote, quote, "Only the communists resist. Obviously the struggle is not equal. They have all the forces of the state against them. But for lack of numbers, they have ardor, fanaticism. They fought for the street." Unquote. In 1 month, according to official statistics, there were 62 deaths in street battles, including 29 communists, 14 Nazis, and 8 socialists. Footnote: this is citing Gilbert Badia's History of Contemporary Germany, Volume 2, 1933 to 1962. Badia's works are the only ones that reserve a decent place for communist resistance. Back to the main text. These figures are much lower than the reality. One only has to read the pages that Richard Krebs, under the pseudonym Jan Faltin, devoted to the street battles in Hamburg to realize the incredible violence of the confrontations. Footnote, citing Faltin's With Neither Homeland Nor Borders 1997, this book must be read with caution though. Its author did belong to the clandestine Comintern apparatus with which he came into conflict when he received the order to return to Hamburg to reconstitute the networks of the International Seamen and Dockers International, ISH. Arrested, tortured, he denounced the comrades who were housing him and became an agent of the Gestapo, without an order from the Comintern, which is what he claimed to try to clear himself. Having become a man to be shot by the NKVD and the security service, S-Apparat of the Comintern, Krebs fled to the United States in 1937. A biography of Richard Krebs was published, Ernst von Waldenfels' Der Spion, der aus Deutschland kam, das geheime Leben des Seemanns Richard Krebs, Aufbau Verlag, Berlin, 2002. Back to the main text. As it became clearer every day that the KPD would have the underbelly, the party prepared for a long period of clandestinity, being underground. It was at this point that many experienced, as well as little-known activists were instructed to pretend to join the Nazi Party, NSDAP, in order to carry out undermining and intelligence work. When the Nazis came to power, the SPD continued to vacillate the KPD's analysis, preferring conciliation to confrontation. The socialists refused to participate in the anti-Hitler general strike in the aftermath of the Reichstag coup. This was a critical decision because the proletariat believed that the general strike could defeat the Nazi coup de force, just as it had defeated the Kapp Putsch, an early attempt by the Nazis to rise, in March 1920. Goebbels' diary shows that the Nazis feared this general strike more than anything else. The first meeting of Hitler's cabinet was entirely devoted to this eventuality. The SPD had been powerless to prevent the right-wing deputies from granting Hitler the benefit of Article 48. The elected representatives of the SPD and the KPD together would have reached the required quorum, but the communist representatives were hunted down, arrested, and tortured on the basis of police lists drawn up by the SPD prefects, while the SPD representatives continued the parliamentary routine. In order to avoid the Nazi criticism of being a, quote, party from abroad, the the SPD left the Socialist International and even approved the Nazi foreign policy program in May 1933. Anything else we can do for you, sir? Footnote, the SPD parliamentary fraction was reduced to 60 seats out of 129 at this vote. 18 of the elected representatives were in prison, while the others were in exile or involuntary political retirement. And commenting, just to be clear, that's not involuntary political retirement. They were in voluntary political retirement. Possibly reminiscent of all the resignations that we've seen in 2025 at various levels of the U.S. government in response to the Trump administration tightening the screws and demanding different actions from their agencies. Back to the main text. While several social democratic leaders went into camps or exile, many others collaborated or remained in the Reich without further concern. Minister Severing, for example, withdrew from business but remained in Germany, receiving his pension under the new regime. This was also the case with Noske, the socialist leader who had led the crushing of the Spartacists and the massacre of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. The Social Democratic leadership in Württemberg decided to dissolve itself by calling on the SPD municipalities to, quote, support the new order and the national revolution, unquote. Comment, again, so much for we'll gradually bring in socialism. Continuing, when the Berlin section of the Young Socialist Workers organized clandestine work and protected the organization's money from the Nazis, its leader demanded an end to, quote, these small illegal schemes, unquote. In the Berlin-Brandenburg district, sections of the SPD's order service, the Reichsbanner, which had 160,000 militiamen, received this circular, quote, we are left with 3 possibilities. And commenting, these aren't numbered in the original, but for the sake, because this is an audiobook of clarity, I will number them. Continuing, first, the use of the violent methods of the communists. But it is clear to every one of our comrades that these methods are criminal and must be left aside. Because again, commenting of course, not being a quote-unquote criminal by the Nazi framework, much more important than effectively fighting fascism. Continuing, second, abstention. Third, the search for collaboration within the framework of practical life. Wow. For years, we have carried in our hearts faith in Germany and in the future of Germany. That is why we will claim our place in the new life of the German state and do for Germany what it expects of us, our duty. Fucking wow, that is amazing. The executive committee negotiates with the competent authorities about the activity of our association. The following points are fundamental: culture of friendship, assistance to veterans, youth education, military preparation, voluntary work service, unquote. All the testimonies attest both to the communist resistance and to the social democratic debacle. And commenting, again, if you want more on that, the complicity of social democracy in taking positions within the Nazi government, see Fascism and Social Revolution by Dutt. Again, we have it as an audiobook. Continuing, from press articles, quote, the attitude of the communists in front of the bloody and implacable judges was so exemplary that one had the impression that they alone had been given the mandate to maintain the resistance, that's quoting Badia, to Secret Service reports. Quote, first of all, let us note that no Communist Party leader bowed to the National Revolution. Footnote, only one of the 422 KPD leaders went over. Ernst Torgler had been Dimitrov's co-defendant in the famous Leipzig trial. He suffered a deep depression during the trial and adopted an individual defense, refusing the party's instruction to accuse the Nazis of burning down the Reichstag as, quote, suicidal. Expelled from the KPD in 1935, liberated in 1936, he was a salesman until the war, and accepted a post in a ministry during the war. He ended his life in the FRG as a member of the SPD. That's citing Badia's The Reichstag Fire, the act of the birth of the Nazi regime, and Problems, 1983. Back to the main text, and in the middle of quoting the Secret Service report, all of them, Communist Party leaders, are in prison, on the run, or in hiding. It is mainly communists who have gone to populate the concentration camps. Others have gone abroad. The need for the leaders who have remained at their posts to hide and work clandestinely reduces their action to very little, and it is even doubtful that their work can be prolonged for long in the presence of searches by a police force developed to the extreme. If the communists who, it must be repeated, showed an indisputable nerve until last March are at this point, it is easy to imagine how far the comment much softer, continuing socialists have gone. They have only known how to bow or flee like Braun, Gerzesinski, Breitscheid, Dittmann, Crisprin, Noske, Bergmann, unless they bring to the new regime a more or less veiled adherence like Leipart, Grossman, Tarnov, Wels, Stampfer, Hilferding. And that's quoting the report of the Renseignements Généraux of May 18, 1933, exhumed by the historian Annie Lacroix. The Social Democratic Union leadership also gave in very quickly to the Nazis. Its president wrote to Hitler to inform him that the ADGB had broken with the SPD. On March 20, the ADGB published a damning manifesto, quote, "The trade union organizations are the expression of an irrefutable social necessity, an indispensable part of the social order itself. According to the natural order of things, they have become more and more integrated into the state. The social function of the trade unions must be fulfilled, whatever the nature of the regime of the state." Yeah, see what the Nazis' opinion of that is. The trade union organizations do not claim to directly influence state policy. Their task in this sense can only be to place at the disposal of the government and parliament the knowledge and experience they have acquired in this field, unquote. So commenting, basically, we're just advisors. You know, you need us, but we get it. You're totally co-opting us, and we'll do whatever you say. In fact, all we're going to do is just present some knowledge to you, but you're the expert. You do with it what you want. Continuing. On April 22, 1933, the ADGB announced that it was leaving the International Federation of Trade Unions. The ADGB undertook to unite with the National Socialist Factory Cell Organization, NSBO, to form a single trade union and participated on Nazi commemoration of May 1st. But these capitulations did not save it from the ban. The NSDAP remained in a minority in the March 1933 elections, but it enjoyed the support of the right-wing parties in Parliament to grant Hitler the full powers provided for in Article 48. Repression gradually extended to trade unionists. The SA occupied the trade union building on May 2, 1933, and arrests began the next day. The Social Democrats, the SPD, disbanded on June 22, 1933, and Christians opposed to Nazi warmongering and racism. By July 1933, tens of thousands of people had been interned, and there were 27,000 political prisoners in the concentration camps. In November, 60,000 communist militants were arrested and 2,000 murdered. Trials were held in a chain reaction. On May 23rd, 2 communist activists were the first to be sentenced to death by the new regime. Nazi repression left activists who had been unable or unwilling to leave Germany with a choice between 3 mindsets. Some, discouraged by the terrible defeat of the communist movement, deprived of leadership, and intimidated by state terror, abandoned the struggle. Among them were a handful of leaders because not all of them were up to the dizzying height of events. At the end of April 1933, for example, the Arbeiter Zeitung, an organ of the KPD in Saarland, the German region occupied by France from 1919 to 1935, published this opinion, quote, "The district of the KPD, Baden-Palatinate, asks us to publish the following exclusion. The deputy to the Reichstag, Benedum Kuzel, who has been living in Saarland for several weeks and who had received orders from the district to return to Germany, did not respond to this invitation. He was expelled from the German Communist Party for cowardice in the face of the class enemy," unquote. A small number of KPD members collaborated with the regime, simple grassroots activists and most often new party members. Footnote, the KPD was emerging from a period of purges in 1932. And commenting, a purge is when party members are required to re-register. Continuing, 4 or 5% of its members had been in the party since its founding 12 years earlier, and more than 40% had been in the party for less than a year. Back to the main text. But tens of thousands of communists adopted a position of resistance. Often there was a long way from this position to organized and effective clandestine action. Party structures crumbled, cadres were imprisoned or exiled, sympathizers were watched. But clandestine party organizations were reconstituted very quickly, to be generally just as quickly dismantled and rebuilt again. And that's the end of Chapter 1, the KPD in the Face of the Rise of Hitlerism, from the German Communist Resistance, available free as a PDF from foreignlanguages.press. There will be a link to that in the description as always, and there's a lot worth reading in the rest of this book. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to cover any more chapters out of the book. I might do a couple more, I might not. Whatever the case, I do recommend that you read the rest of it. It is worth it. 2 closing notes here from me. Number 1, what I think really needs to come through in the discussion when we're talking especially with liberals or less politically knowledgeable people about the rise of neo-fascism in the early 21st century is that this is a manifestation of class struggle. All the people who bought into the idea that capitalism was just here to stay forever, well, no, it's having another massive crisis, and everything happening now is a result of that. putting the present moment as well as this history being discussed in that proper context is super important for people to have the right orientation to it, and you'll be saving them a ton of time and probably making some new allies for a real resistance. And off of that point two, is people often ask me what socialist or communist or leftist organizations or parties they should join. And while I think that there are some smaller pre-party formations or study groups or even some small parties that are anti-revisionist and actually do the reading as communists are supposed to do, I don't see one that is definitely clearly going to take the lead and survive the jump or the growth period from being small into being the leader of a major movement that's going to take power and dismantle capitalism. And that's not to slam any of those groups. It's just that there are too many unknown factors between now and reaching that point. We just really don't know at this stage what exactly it's going to look like and what the whole exact course of events is going to be. And to be clear, when we get past this whole situation and the rise of neo-fascism, it will be because there were major new socialist revolutions. There's really no other way out of this political crisis, which is really a crisis of capitalism, entering now not just a massive financial bubble, which maybe they can keep afloat for a few more years on AI hype, maybe they can't, but also a massive ecological crisis, which again, it will take moving beyond capitalism to solve. And of course, I'm talking about climate collapse, climate emergency. But anyway, as regards the question of which are good organizations, I would certainly at this point look to which parties and organizations demonstrate real leadership and bring the most success to the on-the-ground, real-world, high-stakes trials and tests that are now unfolding in cities like Minneapolis. It is important for a vanguard party to have correct Marxist-Leninist orientation. That means studying. The organizational aspect is also hugely important for just carrying out the work. Even if you have a correct program, if you don't know how to run an organization, if you don't have the connections, the safe houses, familiarity with tactics, etc., then you're not going to be able to carry out your program and demonstrate that leadership, gain the confidence of the masses, etc. Now, on the other side, an organization can have good tactics and be able to make gains in the day-to-day struggle in the immediate moment, and that is super important. If they have a revisionist line, if they do assume leadership and the workers' movement starts to gain real momentum, that's going to guide people off of the path of revolution. Sooner or later, there's going to be some critical political question that comes up that they're going to take a wrong position on. And that could be extremely costly. So it's important during more of like a downtime period when there's not major clashes going on in the streets to do the studying, to try to combat erroneous lines in a party, because sooner or later, nothing doesn't happen forever. Sooner or later, something is going to pop up like this, and then it's all hands on deck. For example, as I said, we were doing the Lenin against Trotsky playlist because this is an important point. The Trotskyists are trying to organize, especially in the US and the UK, and we need newer comrades to understand why you should not organize around Trotsky and to know the history. That is the time to do the internal criticisms to get your house in order, because you never know when some other action like this is going to pop off, and then it's all hands on deck. You have a war to resist. You have the occupation of domestic cities to resist, etc. So anyway, as far as which organizations and parties to join, obviously keep in mind as far as communist organizations, whether it's a study group, whether it's a pre-party formation, whatever, to ones that actually do the reading, do the studying, like any communist has to do, and does not take a revisionist stance toward major world events and situations. But then also on the organizational side, this is where knowing your local left comes into play, and having all those coalitions and networks and contacts, because you never know which organization is actually going to be really effective in that resistance on that kind of operational level. Ultimately, this is not just a history debate and discussion club. We're trying to study the history to apply it to the movement. That is the point. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters who helped to make this possible and whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without them, particularly as I don't run ads or sponsorships and don't ever intend to. So if you like this channel, have learned something from it, want to see more from it to help not just yourself but others learn from it, thank me, but also thank a patron or buy me a coffee supporter and consider becoming one yourself. It really does help. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life as discussed previously. So make sure to apply what you've learned here to your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.